the morning. Senator Veronica Maina.
Honorable Speaker, thank you for this opportunity to speak into this very important motion, which on the very onset, I want to indicate that I fully support because of the nature and the importance of this motion. Honorable Speaker, we have been thrown into this position where we are at now by the demonstrations that were commenced by Gen Z. These are our children, Honorable Speaker. And Honorable Speaker, they have observed, they have seen how the governance is being carried out in the Republic of Kenya, Mr. Speaker, and they have found there are gaps and issues that have been wanting, Honorable Speaker. It's very regrettable, and I offer my deepest condolences, Mr. Speaker, to all the families who lost their children during this demonstration. It was uncalled for, Mr. Speaker, and maybe it could have been done in a much better way, because no life needed to be lost, Mr. Speaker. This nation has been in crisis in different times, but maybe the actors were different, Mr. Speaker, because one of the periods when this nation was in a crisis was when the new constitution, the Constitution 2010, was being made, Mr. Speaker. And the way it was crafted by the drafters of that constitution, Mr. Speaker, I look at Article 10 of the Constitution and I ask myself, if only the public sector, the state officers, public officers, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary had bound themselves to the national values and principles of governance in Kenya, would we still have been where we were at last week on Tuesday, Mr. Speaker? And in this Article 10, Mr. Speaker, we see the values and the principles that have been enunciated, Mr. Speaker, under the Constitution. And these principles are supposed to apply and be interpreted in line with any person or any state organ, state officers, public officers who are entrusted with public responsibility of performing any public duty. And these principles are supposed to apply across board and to any person who is given an opportunity to implement any public policy decision. And in these national values and principles of governance, which include patriotism, national unity, sharing and devolution of power, the rule of law, democracy, and participation of the people are some of the principles that are supposed to guide the governance and the implementation of any public policy, Mr. Speaker. A respect to human dignity, equity, social justice, inclusiveness, equality, human rights, non-discrimination, and protection of the marginalized, Mr. Speaker. And when I look at Article 10, 1C, Mr. Speaker, about good governance, integrity, transparency, and accountability, and having regard to sustainable development, if only we had paid more attention, Mr. Speaker, as public officers, as state officers, would we have been where we were last week on Tuesday, Mr. Speaker? I specifically look at the Senate, the role of Senate as laid out, very well laid out in the Constitution on issues of good governance, transparency, and accountability, and the fact that we have a function of oversight over the counties. Is there anything we could have done better than how we have done? Maybe yes, Mr. Speaker, maybe there are areas, and there are areas that we need to improve also as a House, Mr. Speaker. The storm we saw in this nation, sweeping this nation, Mr. Speaker, and Parliament being at the eye of this storm, it was also an indictment to the institution of Parliament. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, and to follow what the other speakers have said, because today is not a day of competing on who gives a better speech or who does better debating than the other, I want to apologize that if we have failed as senators, Mr. Speaker, we are sorry. I am sorry, Mr. Speaker. Are there any tools that would have enhanced transparency, that would have slowed down issues of corruption, Mr. Speaker, I have served in other respects, even as a Secretary General of the ruling party, former Secretary General of the ruling party, Mr. Speaker. And I know for a fact it is possible to run a system without collecting a bribe, from my own experience, Mr. Speaker. And I want, as we do this debate, Mr. Speaker, that first of all, it forms a platform for us to have an introspection as Senate, Mr. Speaker. That's our tool. When we do the CPIC and the CPAC committees, what do we do with the reports that emanate from counties where we can see that corruption is rampant, Mr. Speaker? It is my view that as a way of improving the system so that we can have the public inject their confidence once again in this institution, is that the reporting back of those notorious counties should come back to the floor of this House, Mr. Speaker, and action must be taken. Concerted, Mr. Speaker, collective action agreed upon all the senators that what needs to be done by EACC with counties that have had wanton corruption and misuse of public fund, Mr. Speaker, that concrete action must be taken. And Mr. Speaker, we have also had a chance as a House to look at some of the impeachment proceedings. It has also given us time to reflect, Mr. Speaker, on how we have conducted those proceedings and whether they have met the expectation, the legitimate expectation, Mr. Speaker, of the population, Mr. Speaker. To the Gen Z who have woken us up, Mr. Speaker, and who have called institutions to rethink how we are conducting our business, Mr. Speaker, I want to say, this being our children, they have done well and in a very bold way. Without any experience, without having any forms of arms, Mr. Speaker, they came out to resoundingly say something must change. And the finance bill was the trigger, Mr. Speaker. They were not comfortable with how that finance bill was phrased, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that they felt they were not listened to. Was this an expression of just the Gen Z? Maybe it was an expression of many more Kenyans who may not have had an opportunity to express themselves. Mr. Speaker, these young people came out as true patriots, tribeless, without any boundary, Mr. Speaker. They defeated the class division, and they came out, Mr. Speaker, to speak resoundingly. My only unfortunate moment, Mr. Speaker, was when the demonstration was infiltrated and turned violent, Mr. Speaker, and there was a standoff between the demonstrators and the law enforcement and security officers, Mr. Speaker. The conflict that ended up landing some of them into mortuaries, Mr. Speaker. And as Kenyans, Mr. Speaker, we need to have a retrospection of all the officers, the state officers who are seated in public offices. If there was something that was happening that was off and had a tendency to have a corrupt tag, this means the storm now must stop on corrupt practices, Mr. Speaker. Let everybody look through how they are conducting their affairs, beginning with us, Mr. Speaker, because today we are talking about ourselves, more of ourselves. How are we conducting our affairs? For those who are Christians like myself, the good book will guide us into what is godly order. For those who are Muslims, Mr. Speaker, while we are guided by the Bible, the Muslims will be guided by the Quran. But for the nation, Mr. Speaker, we have the Constitution that guides how governance must be done and how structures should be laid out, Mr. Speaker. Where we have gone wrong, Mr. Speaker, does that Constitution offer us an avenue of ventilation? Mine is to call upon the Gen Z. Now that we have begun to listen to what they have to say, mine is to call upon the Gen Z to allow us to walk the order of the Constitution, to accept that an olive branch now has been given by our President, Mr. Speaker, and that is the highest level of executive commitment, that the President is willing to have a forum with the young people, with the Gen Z, and discuss issues that need to be thrashed out, Mr. Speaker. must be taken as a sign of very, very goodwill, Mr. Speaker. And there are those issues that have been laid out. Is it possible for a nation to change within a day? Is it possible for a nation to change within a day? I see it has signaled an opportunity for us to begin the change. And while all the demands may not be met overnight within a week, within 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, yet some of those things that are glaring, Mr. Speaker, like dealing with the corrupt cases, dealing with issues that are obvious and that have evidence, Mr. Speaker, that ball should begin rolling, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because if we cannot face the change, then change will change us, Mr. Speaker. It is my view, Mr. Speaker, that if we can honestly face ourselves, the society to face itself, EACC to also come out of slumber, take up those files, prosecute those that need to be prosecuted where there is sufficient evidence, Mr. Speaker, that corruption has happened within institutions, Mr. Speaker, then even the Gen Z will begin to see that we are serious and committed to upholding the dignity of every Kenyan, Mr. Speaker. Regarding the jobs, it is true, Mr. Speaker, there has been, the youth have faced a lot of unemployment, and I can only imagine how distressing, Mr. Speaker, this is when a young person has gone through schooling and has nothing to do, Mr. Speaker, and yet we are supposed to give solutions as leaders, Mr. Speaker. Those are issues that now need to be tackled in a different way. Is there bias in the way public office employs young people? Mr. Speaker, we need to straighten out the processes. We need to do things, Mr. Speaker, in a different way. And I want to specifically look at the suggestion that has been done by SRC for the raising the salary, Mr. Speaker, of the senators and members of parliament, Mr. Speaker. That proposal, while it may have been good because everybody needs a raise at any point when they are working, a worker needs to be motivated, the timing is so wrong and it is not needed, Mr. Speaker. Least of all by the honorable members. I haven't met one single member still, Mr. Speaker, and I'm only repeating this because it has been said, but we are repeating it to affirm the fact, Mr. Speaker, that none of these officers seated here today, none of these legislators had asked for that increment. And we would call upon the SRC to be a little bit more serious with their tasks. They have a heavy, their in tray is full with claims by intern doctors, Mr. Speaker, with claims from JSS, Mr. Speaker, the teachers in JSS, Mr. Speaker. Have those issues been handled yet? Are there opportunities where young people could be accommodated within the public sector where that available funding can then be disbursed towards supporting them, Mr. Speaker? We need to think outside the box and say, let's do things differently, Mr. Speaker, because if we do not do it differently, Mr. Speaker, once again, the change would change us, Mr. Speaker. I want to commend the Gen Z and also note that their level of debate, Mr. Speaker, in spite of the fact that there were quite a number of insults that are coming across the X space, I have also equally noted, Mr. Speaker, that these are very young, intelligent Kenyans, Mr. Speaker. Their level of debate is very different from the levels of debates that we are having, Mr. Speaker. And for a moment, I asked myself, could this be the reason that maybe they don't watch the mainstream media? Because their level of analysis of issues was different and was very refined. They have facts and figures. There is nothing you would tell them about who was given which tender, Mr. Speaker. They are able to analyze for you from county number 1 to county number 47, how many tenders have been awarded by each county, who has been awarded, which companies have been awarded, who owns those companies. All that information, Mr. Speaker, is with the Gen Z. I must commend the level of transparency, because it's only when we are transparent and open with ourselves and with the systems and with the processes that change will begin to sweep across the whole nation, Mr. Speaker. All I want to persuade now, Mr. Speaker, to the Gen Z and to the people of Kenya, we have a nation Many of us do not have an alternative to our nation, our statehood here. We belong to Kenya, Mr. Speaker. We are Kenyan citizens, Mr. Speaker. We do not even have dual citizenship, some of us. We have no other home except this home called Kenya. And Mr. Speaker, Kenya has been like a labor ward for many nations in this region, especially in the Great Lakes region, Mr. Speaker. And we must preserve our nationhood. We call for peace. We call for the end of the demonstrations, Mr. Speaker, and we allow dialogue to happen. We allow an opportunity for us to sit together. And I want to say to the Gen Z, who are our children actually, I'm a mother to 3 Gen Zs, Mr. Speaker, that if they ever had a friend, they have a friend in Senate. We are open to receive every petition. We are open to listen to them. We are open to see the issues that they don't agree, Mr. Speaker, with us, Mr. Speaker, and we are ready to implement what we can legislatively do to ensure that their confidence in us, Mr. Speaker, is restored. And I have also noted, Mr. Speaker, that they had very big issues also with the church. For some, they supported the church. For some, they had very big issues with the church and religious institutions, Mr. Speaker. And that has also now called for change in the way we conduct public officers, conduct their business with religious bodies, Mr. Speaker, so that if the fundraisers are causing so much trouble and so much drama, then, Mr. Speaker, it is time for us to rethink our position on how we handle that. And I speak that both as a believer and a very strong church member, that it is important we preach this gospel and preach it in such a way that, Mr. Speaker, it is acceptable not only to our age group, but it's also acceptable to our young children, acceptable to our young adults, acceptable to the students, and acceptable to the whole population, Mr. Speaker. This is an issue that has been pending on our in-tray, and a lot of pressure has come on the politicians also, if we can be honest about the fundraisers, Mr. Speaker, because when your competitor as a politician gives some money for fundraiser, which another politician cannot match, Mr. Speaker, instantly there is a liking by the public towards the one who is giving, and the one who is not giving is seen as though they are not working, Mr. Speaker. So the definition of public work or public service has to now be separated from fundraiser aspect, Mr. Speaker, so that a legislator who is supposed to be in parliament doing oversight, doing legislation, doing representation, Mr. Speaker, must not be seen as a money minting machine. So we need to slow down, even as Kenyans, how we conduct our business with the public officers. For instance, when a Kenyan is paying a bribe to a police officer, is it a member of parliament who asked them to pay that bribe? Maybe not, Mr. Speaker. It's a cultural change. And what the Gen Zs have said is that it is time for us to change our culture. We must be able to offer an environment, a governance environment, Mr. Speaker, where we can work 24 hours. We work daytime, we work at night, and women and children will have the security to walk through the streets, Mr. Speaker, and be able to conduct their businesses within a 24-hour economy. Mr. Speaker, I know Kenyans are smart people. We have seen the wanton destruction of property. My deepest apologies to all the business people who have suffered losses, heavy losses, and as a result of which a number of people may equally lose jobs. Young people will lose jobs, Mr. Speaker. That's an unfortunate position, one which we should not have found ourselves in. I walked through Mamagina Street, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, and all those businesses, they have been broken. Some thieves, some criminals broke into those businesses, Mr. Speaker, and took away the stocks that were in that shop. The display windows are gone, Mr. Speaker. They need to not only repair the premises, but restock the businesses before they can give anybody any job. That is not a position we would wish to be in, Mr. Speaker. And it's my very humble plea to Kenyans that we allow ourselves to go back to normal day, Mr. Speaker, when there is a busy activity in Mamagena Street, in downtown, Mr. Speaker, in the uptown, Mr. Speaker, in our malls, Mr. Speaker, and what we have seen happen happening to Quickmart must not happen to any other business in Republic of Kenya. For a very long time, Kenya has been setting the trend for the East African region and has been setting the trend for the Great Lakes region and in Africa, Mr. Speaker, and we must allow ourselves to bounce our nation back to a position of being a great example to be emulated in Africa. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity.
Senator Okongo Mogeni.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me an opportunity to also contribute to this motion. Mr. Speaker, from the onset, I stand to support the bipartisan approach that has been adopted by the majority side and the minority. So I want to thank Senator Cheruiyot, our youthful leader, majority leader from the majority side, and our elder, Justice Retired Stuart Mazayo, who under the leadership of Senator Wambua have brought us together to have a discourse as Kenyans. We thank you, our dear colleagues. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I first want to pass my message of condolences to the mothers, the fathers, brothers and sisters of